Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. And thank you for that lovely homage by Jack Campbell there and his team. Is Jack here? Oh. Well, anyway, I'm Jeremy Corbyn. No, it's all right. I'm Arthur Smith, and I'm going to be your host this evening. And I'm going to be asking Geoff a few questions, because if we go back, 31 years, there he was, a young student, wondering what he was going to do with his life. Should he become a professional wrestler? Should he open a Chinese restaurant? Or, even worse, should he go into insurance? But he had a little idea while he was dreaming up his future, and we're all here because of that this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage himself, Geoff Rowe. Geoff, I hope you're going to be all right with being the centre of attention, because you've made so many other people the centre of attention over the years.
Well, I'll give it a go. I've got a really bad back, so No, I really have. So,
no, you've got a lovely back. I've seen it. All right, so tell us how it all started, Geoff.
Well, this is a bit weird, right? Because most of you know the story as much as I do, if not even better than I do. So it's a rare occurrence where I can't really bullshit, and I kind of have to tell you the truth, really. But, I mean, that little film kind of gave some of the story, but it doesn't focus on the other people who I was a student with at De Montfort University, who were part of our year group, who worked really hard with me in that first year to set up the festival. So what happened?
Were you in your last year at university when you started it?
If anybody can correct me when I go wrong, just feel free to shout out, right? But what I remember is that our lecturer at the time, Chris Morn, told us in the last term of the summer of '93, so that was our second year, that in our final year we had to do a practical project. And
what were you studying then?
Arts management.
Right.
And so we went to the Student Union bar at Scraptoft campus. This is how I remember it. And we sat around, and there wasn't a huge amount of enthusiasm to do anything. I don't really remember. But at the time, I think I was certainly, and I think other people on the course were big music fans, and we read NME every week. And NME started to talk about stand-up, and people like Sean Hughes and Rob Newman and David Baddiel were on the front cover of the NME, and they allegedly sold out Wembley Arena. So it was kind of big news.
Yeah, comedy was the new rock and roll, is what they used to say. Yeah.
Comedy was the new rock and roll. And I remember, and some people in this room will remember this person, but I think a guy called Aston Stevens said, "Why don't we put on a comedy festival?" Now, the alternative, I seem to remember, was that one of our lecturers, it wasn't Chris, but one of our lecturers wanted us to do a festival of Eastern European theatre. So count yourselves lucky, because we could all be here celebrating 30 years of Leicester's Festival of Eastern European Theatre. That didn't get us terribly excited. So Aston said, "Why don't we put on a comedy festival?" And I think we all went, all right, why not? It seemed like a good idea.
So there was a lot of enthusiasm.
Well, there was a lot of enthusiasm, which was weird, given the fact that, I mean, I had never promoted comedy before.
Had you ever been to the Edinburgh Festival?
No, yes. A number of years before I came to Leicester, I went with a band that I was sort of working for. And so I don't know whether anybody else on the course had been to Edinburgh. I'd seen comedy here. I remember seeing Linda Smith here, and I remember seeing Lee Evans here, I think, shortly after he won the Perrier Award. So none of us really had a clue what we were doing, but it did seem exciting. The idea of putting on a comedy festival, because we were reading about it in the NME, it sounded really exciting. But none of us had a clue what we were doing, I don't think. I mean, none of us knew comedians, agents, promoters, nothing. So we decided to do it, and then I think I, and maybe James, who's here today, who was the co-director in that first year.
Hello, James.
Hello, James. I think we then started to have meetings with people, and I met, well, we already knew because of the course, we already knew Ian Stevens from the Y and Richard Haswell, who is here, and just had started working here. And we started to talk about, over that sort of summer holidays between our second year and third year, we started to talk to people about the idea of a comedy festival in Leicester. And people seemed to think it was a really good idea. I mean, I don't think, the City Council thought it was a good idea. The then East Midlands Arts, which became the Arts Council, they thought it was a good idea. And so they're sort of...
Did they give you any money?
They did give us, I think, £500 in the first year.
Well, that was a lot back then.
It was a lot back then. It was very generous of them. And so the other thing I knew was I'd worked in London for a year before coming to Leicester, and I'd worked for a band, and that band was starting to get sort of some interest from TV people. And one of the people that were working with us was a woman called Sandy, and she produced comedy on television. So I rang Sandy and said, tell me everything I need to know. And I don't know whether other people here remember this, but we all, I think as a student group, went down to the Red Rose Comedy Club, which you all remember, in Finsbury Park, and we saw the Rubber Bishops.
With Bill Bailey.
With Bill Bailey. And that was amazing, because that was like, I mean, it sounds weird now, but it was a real comedy club in London.
Yeah.
And we thought, this is going to be amazing, so let's do this and let's set up the festival. So it was part of our student course. And I don't know whether you're going to ask me this or not, but quite a lot of people ask me, why is it in February?
Why is it in February?
It's a very good question, Arthur. The reason it is in February is because we were in our final year and were going to graduate. And so we had to work backwards from graduation time to when we had to get, because we had to write reports on what we did with the festival, and the reports had to be marked by our lecturers. And so we kind of worked back on the calendar and went, well, it's got to be in February, which at the time was a terrible time to run a festival, really. And largely
well, it still is in a way, except that there's only one festival in February, and it's the Leicester one.
Yeah. So there was a Birmingham Comedy Festival. I think there was a Newcastle. Paul Snedden and Dave Johns in Newcastle had set one up. They went bust quite quickly, both of them, the Birmingham one and the Newcastle one. And so we sort of looked at what they were doing a little bit, but we just made it up as we went along, really.
So how many acts were on? What was the first festival like? How many shows were there? And how did you book the acts? And
so there was about, I think, 50, maybe 40 or 50 shows. Richard from here was unbelievably brilliant and supportive, because on one of the pictures that you saw up there was of Graham Fellows, John Shuttleworth, and he was in the first festival. And Richard had been in Bury, and so had booked a lot of comedy in Bury. So he was really encouraging. But the festival program in that year was quite diverse. Now, possibly it was diverse because we wanted to get some money out of the Arts Council. That might be the case, or grants from the City Council. But it had stand-up. Harry Hill was... Does anybody remember that gig with Harry Hill and Matt Lucas? Yeah, okay. So Matt Lucas, as Sir Bernard Chumley, supported Harry Hill at the Student Union at Scraptoft. It was probably one of the most glamorous gigs they'd ever done to this day. John Shuttleworth, Donna McPhail and Rona Cameron performed here. But also the diversity was important. So we did Nick Park, who created Wallace and Gromit. Yeah. A friend of mine knew Nick, and so I contacted Nick and said, would he come up and do a Q&A about Wallace and Gromit and all that kind of stuff. So he did. We did a tour around Age UK community centres. I think it was a show with a woman who worked here called Ashley Christmas. And they toured a little funny theatre show, really, I suppose, to Age UK centres. So there were films. It was pretty diverse. But in answer to your question, how did we book it? We relied an awful lot on Richard and Ian in particular. Judy Hughes, who was the programmer here, was amazing. And we just relied on other people to tell us what to do, really. because nobody knew who we were, Arthur. We were just a bunch of students, and we didn't admit to that to the outside world. I remember having a conversation with Avalon, the agency Avalon, about the idea of a comedy festival, and never in a million years did I tell them that we were students or it was a student project, because I think people would have thought, oh, it's not real. It was never, it's never going to happen if it's just.
So when did you get Tony Slattery and Norman Wisdom to be patrons? Does people remember Norman Wisdom?
I hope so. I was going to say he's not dead, but he is very much dead.
Is there anybody here who's never had sex under a Labour government?
Is that one of the questions I gave you to ask? So no one knew who we were, and we were completely anonymous to the kind of comedy industry, I suppose, or anybody really. And so I can't really remember, I don't know whether anybody else can, but I can't really remember where it came from. But somewhere in that thing, we decided we should get some patrons, because we in those days, I think most people here are probably old enough to remember letters. Probably old enough. So we had a letterhead.
Yeah, with postage stamps and everything.
Yeah. We had to get, and faxes. We had to have a letterhead. And Claire Walker, who was one of the students, went home for the weekend, and her then boyfriend designed a logo for us, which is broadly speaking the logo that smile that we've got as festival logo. Her boyfriend Sean designed that, and he came back and said, Claire said, oh, well, we've got a logo. And we all went, great, we've got a logo, we'll put it on the letterhead. But nobody knew who we were, so we thought if we got some patrons, we could put them on the letterhead, and then when it came out of the fax machine, it would say Leicester Comedy Festival, and people would go, oh, they're patrons, and it would be a bit of interest. Norman Wisdom is a comedy legend. And I think I went to the library at Scraptoft, and in the library there were books.
Wow, in the library there were books. Amazing.
And there were directories, so you could look up Norman Wisdom and it would say his manager is Johnny Manns and this is his address. So I wrote a letter to Norman Wisdom and said, you have no idea who we are. You've probably never been to Leicester before, but we're setting up a comedy festival and would you be a patron? And somewhere I still have the letter that Norman wrote back and said he'd be delighted to be a patron. That was a real, oh my God, moment, because like Norman Wisdom saying he'll be a patron. And then Tony Slattery at the time was, probably by his own admission, was on television way too much in 1993, 94. He was massive. And a friend of mine who lived in London, one of the things that Jim used to say to me all the time was, he lives next door to Tony Slattery. And he would put his bins out at night, or the milk bottles, and he'd turn, and there would be this, enormously famous person. So because I knew where Jim lived, and I had his address, I therefore knew where Tony lived.
Real business thinking.
So I wrote to him and said, you don't know who we are either. We've got Norman Wisdom as a patron. Would you be a patron of the festival? And the way I remember it, and it may not be absolutely true, is that in our student house, some people here will remember somebody called Sal Fraser, and I was sharing a student house with her, and the phone rang, and she answered it, and she shouted upstairs, Geoff, it's the phone, and I shouted down, who is it? And she said, well, he says it's Tony Slattery, which was that was another oh my God moment, really. And so I spoke to Tony, and then James, who I mentioned earlier on, and Tony said, come down to the Groucho Club. What the fuck was the Groucho Club? We had no idea what we were doing. I had to ring my friend Sandy and say, what do you wear when you go to the Groucho Club? Extraordinary. And James is on video somewhere online saying we sold the concept to Tony. We did sell the concept to Tony, but we also got unbelievably pissed with Tony Slattery. I mean, we were like
And
students.
did you go to the toilets with Tony?
We didn't go to the toilets with Tony. No, I don't know what you're referring to there.
I think Tony used to like to go to the toilets a lot.
He did. And we got really drunk, and Tony said, yeah, I'll be a patron. And so then, I think before we booked anybody, we had this idea of a comedy festival. And Tony Slattery and Norman Wisdom were our patrons. It was incredible.
And did many people turn up to that first festival? Did you get good audiences?
We did, about 5,000. Somewhere there's a record of it in the student report that we had to produce. About 5,000 people came to about 40 shows or something like that. And I mean, most of you were there at the time, so I think people thought it was really exciting. People thought it was great. And there was never a plan to do it again. Somebody found recently a newspaper article from the Leicester Mercury where I lied through my teeth and said, I think this will become a regular event in Leicester, an annual event. We had no idea. That was never the plan at all. We were going to go and get proper jobs. And indeed, most of the students from that year did go and get proper jobs. But yeah, that's what happened.
And how easy was it in those first few years, or how hard was it?
Well, I suppose it was easy-ish. I mean, in the second year, Barry Cryer and Willie Rushton came and did a show in the old Haymarket Theatre, which people might remember. Best title for a show I've ever booked, I think, called Two Old Farts in the Night.
Yeah, I remember that show.
It was really funny. So they came. Alan Davis, there was a picture up there of Alan Davis. And in our second year, the other thing that happened was we got £25,000 from a company called Intercity and Midland Mainline, who are the train company. They're now East Midlands Railways. And they gave us 25 grand. And the reason why the marketing manager gave us 25 grand was she was intrigued as to why we were approaching them for sponsorship. But the other thing was she used to study at Scraptoft campus at De Montfort University. She was a student. And our letterhead then, we had an office at Scraptoft campus. So she was intrigued as to why some people from her old university with Norman Wisdom and Tony Slattery were writing to her to sponsor a comedy festival. And she did. And I remember walking down London Road, I think with Claire Walker and maybe with Abby Palmer, who carried on the festival with me in that sort of first few years. And my mobile phone, which was about this size, rang.
Yeah.
And
I'm on the train.
And they said, no, they said, we are the train. And we're going to give you £25,000. That was extraordinary. So it was, for about 10 years, it wasn't difficult at all, Arthur, because we just messed around for a long time, and it was enormous fun. We didn't earn any money out of it. I mean, I worked behind the bar here for years and did front of house at De Montfort Hall and other venues. And
you didn't take a slice out of the 25 grand?
No, I didn't. I wish I had. No. So it was almost like a hobby. It was almost like we just loved doing it every February, and so we just kept doing it.
And you got that. Tell me about the community element of it all.
Well, that was important, I think. And if I'm completely honest, I think that's part of the reason why we still are here 30 years later, is because, I said earlier on, in that first year we did a show in Age UK centres, whatever it's called, and we did stuff with older people and kids, and we did, for years, we did a show called the Disability Comedy Showcase, featuring disabled acts, obviously. Bit of a terrible name, but that's what it was. And all of that, I think my mantra for years has been that everybody laughs at something, and our job is to cram as many of those things into the festival as possible. So it doesn't matter, especially, I guess, in a city like Leicester, which is very diverse. Not everybody understands or associates or likes stand-up comedy. It's a very, traditionally, has been quite a British English thing, North American English-speaking thing. So we did shows with companies, I can't remember what they're called now, Shruti Arts, that's what they were called, who were an Asian producing company. And they flew people in from India to do shows at the old Haymarket Theatre for several years.
What sort of acts were they?
So very slapstick, very panto. That's how I would describe it.
Oh, no, it wasn't.
We haven't got time to go down that road. So that happened. And I think that, so if your ethos, I guess, if your sort of thing is everybody laughs at something, then it can't just be young stand-ups, right? Young, white, male, straight stand-ups, which is a bit of a stereotype, but that was the dominant thing in stand-up comedy in this country, certainly. So we wanted to broaden that out. And, in the last 5 years, we've set up the UK Kids Comedy Festival, and I think we've produced over 200 projects that use comedy. Rob G, who's here, has fronted loads of these for us over the years, and around men's health, around all sorts of different sort of issues to try and make it a bit more accessible, I suppose, and a bit more palatable to people. But that's been really important, the community side of it.
Yeah, and why is the festival run by a charity? That's quite unusual in the profit-driven industry.
Yeah, so that was, I suppose, for a long time. So it was never a commercial thing. It never is now a commercial thing, really. It always had this sort of ethos. It's difficult to talk about this because you coming in doing a show, Jimmy Carr doing a show, Sarah Miller, that's great. That's wonderful. I don't not like that at all. That's been wonderful. But the sort of community side of it has also been important. And also, I think, increasingly I've talked about the festival as being a celebration of British comedy. It's important, right? I think comedy and humour and laughter is important. So if you have that ethos behind what you're doing, the idea then to apply, largely it was driven, in answer to your question, driven because we wanted to apply for grants. And if you're a charity, it's somewhat easier to apply for grants than if you're not. But we were turned down by the Charities Commission many times. Because
why was that?
Well, because when we applied, we were called Leicester Comedy Festival Limited, and they thought, I assume, that we were just about stand-up comedy and so why is that charitable? It isn't, is it? And then after a period of time, we went through, well, if we were going to be called something else, if the company was going to be called something else, what would it be called? And we had no end of conversations about that and how it was going to work. I mean, like over several years. And then one of our trustees at the time, we were having dinner around somebody's house, and he said, well, what do you actually do? And somebody said, well, we make a big difference. And he said, well, that's what you should be called then. You should be called Big Difference Company. And then we applied to the Charities Commission to become a charity, and they accepted us the first time.
Just because you changed your name to Big Difference?
Yeah, because it sounded more charitable. Than Leicester Comedy Festival did. So then that's when the charity started. And, is that worth it? Is it better that we're a charity than we're not? I don't know is the answer to your question.
And then Dave got involved, the Dave channel.
Yeah, they did. So we had...
Oh, dear.
So we've always had, De Montfort University and Leicester City Council and people like Reach and Equity and all sorts of people have been really generous financially, but also generous in terms of their enthusiasm for what we do. But we never had, well, we did actually. We had NTL. Remember them? NTL were the sponsor of the festival for a few years.
What does NTL stand for?
Well, I don't know. Does anybody know what it stands for? But it became Virgin Media.
Yeah.
So they sponsored us for a while, and we had people like Central TV sponsored us, but we never had a title, like a national title sponsor. And so shall I tell you the story about Dave?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so people might be interested. So I mentioned earlier on my housemate, Sal Fraser, who took the Tony Slattery call. She was working for Dave. She was one of our course who went on to get a proper job. She has done incredibly well in TV and produced all sorts of things that you will have heard of and stuff. So she was working for Dave at the time, and I was going for the first time ever to the Montreal Comedy Festival.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's a huge festival in Canada where there's big stars go, yeah.
Yeah, massive. And I always was like, oh, Montreal Comedy Festival, I'd love to go to that. So I was going to go, and then I was talking to Sal, and Sal said, oh, my boss is going to Montreal Comedy Festival. You'd get on. He's going on his own. You're going on your own. Why don't I email you both and say, you're both going to Montreal, why don't you meet up? So I said, yeah, all right, why not? So Sal emailed me and Steve, and, you know, like you do, we replied and said, oh, when are you getting there? Blah, blah, blah. And we agreed to meet up. And so I went to Montreal Comedy Festival, and it was great. It was fun. I saw Steve Martin live, which was extraordinary.
Oh, he's great.
I was standing backstage in the corridor, just in a row of people. I didn't really know what we were doing there, but we were just standing having a drink. And then, as close as I am to you, a door opened and Steve Martin walked out the door. I was very surprised by that. But anyway, so I agreed to meet Steve. Steve and I met up in Montreal, and we chatted. And
Hang on, Steve Martin?
Steve Norr from Dave.
Yeah.
So we had chats, and we got on, and he's a really nice man. And I didn't really realise at the time, but I think he was kind of trying to. He kept asking me about the festival. What are you trying to achieve with the festival? What is your ambition for the festival? So I just kind of answered him and just thought, why don't we just talk about other things? It was a bit odd. But then on the last day, he said to me, I think we could do some stuff with you. And I was like, all right, that's nice. Dave's a TV channel, and that would be a really good idea. And then he said, I think we might want to sponsor the festival. Would that be all right? To which I said, that would be all right, yes. Thank you very much.
Was that a hard question to answer?
No, it wasn't at all. And so we got back to England, and I kind of thought, I've met this guy, Steve. He's a nice bloke. We get on really well. He said he might want to do something with the festival. You know, let's see. And then he got in touch when I got back here, and he said, let's come down to London and let's go for lunch. So we did. And then Steve and I kind of just started talking really about things. And then he said to me, I think on our second lunch, I think we'd like to be your title sponsor. Would that be all right? And I very quickly said, yes, that would be very nice. And then we were too late for I can't remember the years now, but the first year that they got involved, they were just a small sponsor because we didn't have enough time to turn it around. And then he invited me down again, and Gary Love, who's here today, I think, and maybe Dav will remember, but then he invited us, the team, down to London to meet their team.
Had you ever been to London?
Only with Tony Slattery. But it was a big deal, Arthur. It was like, you know, we didn't really have a team. It was just kind of us messing around every year. So
that's what a team is, really.
Well, I know, but, you know, a marketing department or a social media department. We didn't have any of that. So we went down and we went to the head offices of UK TV, and there was about, I don't know, Gary probably remembers it differently, but I remember there being about 40 of them, and there was about 6 of us. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the deal was put together, and they were our main sponsor for 5 years. But the thing was, it was only a year-on-year thing. So every year it got reviewed, and they signed up for the next year. So we didn't have enough time, really, to think longer term than next year when we were doing the festival. But I have to say, although when they left after 5 or 6 years, it was really difficult. I mean, we had to throw away an enormous amount of stuff that said Dave's Leicester Comedy Festival on it.
Why did they abandon you?
Because it had worked. So what they wanted was they wanted to produce more shows. They wanted to become less known as being just a channel that had reruns of QI and Top Gear. And Steve, to this day, we're still in touch, and he still says, you know, that they left because it worked, and they needed the money that they were giving us to invest in their own programs and their own marketing of what they were doing. Because if you're producing a TV show, you need to market it, right?
Yeah.
But it was brilliant, and I sound like I'm a marketing person, and most of you know I'm really not. But the synergy, nobody said to us, "Oh, Dave's Leicester Comedy Festival." If it had been B&Q Leicester Comedy Festival, I think people would have gone, "That's a bit of a weird thing." But Dave, everybody just went, "That's wonderful. That's brilliant." And it was great. I mean, the money was brilliant that they gave us. It enabled us to do all sorts of things. And I think that, in my mind anyway, that was the moment where so many people would come up to me, you know, agents, managers, comedians and would say, "Oh, Leicester, I've been to your festival every year since it started," and I'd go, "No, you bloody haven't." But it was the transition between being a good festival in Leicester that had a bit of national profile to being something that people responded to much more positively.
Tell us about some of the special events like the pun championships and the new comedian of the year. Well, how do they come about?
So the Leicester Mercury Comedian of the Year competition, which is on tonight, started in '95, and that started because I remember anyway that Claire Walker, who was one of the people working on the festival with me and Abby and others, Claire had a meeting with the editor of the Leicester Mercury, a guy called Nick Carter, and I think Richard Haswell had talked to us about the Northwest or the Manchester New Comedian of the Year or something, and so we sort of thought, well, maybe we should set up a competition, and Nick Carter from the Leicester Mercury was interested enough to put 500 quid on the table as the prize money. And so we said, well, for that, we'll name it the Leicester Mercury Comedian of the Year competition. And it was, in the first few years, I don't think anybody will mind me saying, it was quite shambolic, really. Anyone could enter, any comedian. So essentially, we were pleased when 8 comedians asked to enter the competition, and we said yes to the first 8. And it was a bit ropey to start off with, and then Johnny Vegas won it, and that was, I said shambolic. It was a shambolic show, but it was wonderful. And then very quickly after that, we decided that people can't enter it; they have to be nominated by a promoter to be in it, because that gets rid of all the admin in terms of sifting through all the applications. So somebody like So You Think You're Funny get however many entries they get, and they have to watch them all, and they have to, all of that. We don't have any of that with the Comedian of the Year, because they send us 8 names, and it's shortlisted for us. That's great. The Pun Championships came about with a conversation with Dave, the TV channel. So Will, who used to work for Dave, loved puns, and so much so that when we would go for meetings, we'd all be talking about stuff, and Will would be sat in the corner making puns the whole time. And then they wanted something that was a national event as part of the festival. And so very quickly, it was similar to the conversation that we had in '93 when we came up with the idea for a festival, because this conversation did literally happen in a pub. And within half an hour, we decided to do a pun championships. Yeah. And the original idea was that we would do it in a boxing ring in the round, and we'd have a host, and the acts would go into the boxing ring and compete against each other, and then there'd be a quarter-final, a semi-final, and a final. And we did it the first few years, and we did it at Handsome Hall around the corner with Just a Tonic, and it sold out with not very much effort, I have to say. And
people love a pun.
They do love a pun.
Do you know, I saw a bottle of bleach the other day, and written on it was seriously thick bleach. And I thought that was horrible. I thought that was domestos abuse. That's my entry for this year's pun competition.
So we did it, and then it worked really well. And then I had a conversation with Pete Mitchell at De Montfort Hall, who's the programmer, and said, he was sort of talking to me about the pun championships, and I said, I've always wanted to do it in a boxing ring, in the round, but we haven't got a big enough venue. And Pete said, well, what if we took all the seats out of De Montfort Hall and we put a boxing ring in the middle of the downstairs and we set it out in the round, and we did it like that? Oh, and he also said, and we'll do it just after Panto finishes, so we'll probably have some pyrotechnics left over from Panto. So at the end of the pun championships, we could have pyro coming off the rig. And I was sold. I was like, that sounds amazing. Yes, please. So it moved to De Montfort Hall, and now, we did it a couple of weeks ago. It sells 1,200 tickets, and then Penguin Books rang me up 2 or 3 years ago and said, can we publish a joke book full of puns from the Pun Championships, which is extraordinary. So they did.
Now, tell me, of all the comedians you've worked with, which one was the biggest cunt? Present company accepted.
This is being filmed to go in our archives. I'm not going to tell you, but I'll tell you backstage afterwards. But also, I think those things, I'm keeping back for the book that I will never, ever write about 30 years of Leicester Comedy Festival. So I'm not telling you the answer to that question. There have been a few. There's been a few contenders.
Well, don't say their name, but tell me something cuntish someone's done. And then we can all guess.
We did a show... two then. We did a show at De Montfort Hall with a very well-known comedian. And we had some sponsors for it. And they were all in the festival. And on the stage, not too dissimilar to this, was a massive banner. Leicester Comedy Festival sponsored by these people. And we had about 50 of the sponsors in for the show. And the comedian walked on stage and said, "What's that?" And somebody said, "Oh, it's because it's part of the comedy festival." And they said, "Well, I don't ever perform at comedy festivals." And I said, "Why not?" And they said, "Because there's too much competition for tickets. So I don't like the competition." And I said, "But you've sold out De Montfort Hall tonight, so you don't need to worry about competition." And then they said, "And I'm certainly not performing in front of these logos. Where's my slice of the money?" And I said, "Well, actually, you don't have a slice of the money." So we had to take the banner down, and they said they wouldn't perform unless the banner was...
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you can tell me backstage privately who it is.
I will.
And then I'll tell everyone else who asked me.
And then another one, if you want another
yeah.
one, was at the Y Theatre. They turned up, and we were just setting up, and they insisted that the entire room was cleared for their sound check. And we were all running late.
Why?
I don't know why. You'd have to, no, they are still alive, so you can ask them. So we cleared up everything that we were doing, and we all went out. And as we got out into the bar at the Y Theatre, the then theatre manager came round and said, "Oh, it's all right, you can come back in again now." Because sound checks often are, "Hello, my name's Geoff Rowe. Yeah, does it work? Yeah, it works. Thanks very much." And that was it. We were out of the room for 10 seconds, 15 seconds. But they got their way and they did their sound check with no one in the room.
Oh dear, what an arsehole.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, Geoff.
Well, I was just surprised that you'd done it. And that banner, you're performing today. Oh no, it wasn't you, because they... Oh no, I'm not going to say that.
So how did that... It must have been hard during the pandemic years, in the couple of years there.
Yeah, it was.
How did you cope with that?
Well, I will... So we did our festival in, was it 2020, 21? I can't remember now. But anyway, we did our festival in February. And people were just starting to talk about this COVID thing.
Yeah.
And everyone was, I remember having conversations with people where they were saying, "Oh, but we don't need to worry. It's in China. People are making a mountain out of a molehill. It'll never happen here." And then, so we finished the festival, and then March the 19th or 17th or whenever it was, Boris went on the telly and said, "That's it, we've all got to stay at home." And then people started, other festival directors, other people who I work with, would say, "Oh, you're all right, Geoff. It's us that need to worry, because my festivals, the people from Glastonbury, for example, we're in June. We've got to do something about this right now. You're not until next February. You'll be absolutely fine. It'll last a few weeks, and then it won't be a problem anymore." And then as time went on, I began to think, oh, maybe we do have to think about this COVID thing, because it doesn't seem to be going away. I think some of the trustees of Big Difference are here, so you'll probably remember, but I was really determined that we would do something. We could not have a year off. I think festivals that have a year off often don't recover. They often don't come back for whatever reason. So I was really determined that we wouldn't stop and we would do something. And then the honest answer to your question, Arthur, is I was sat in my little office at home, because we were all working from home, tapping away on my laptop, and increasingly was thinking, I don't know what we're going to do. I honestly don't know what we're going to do. And then a few comedians started getting in touch and saying, is there anything we can do to help? So Tom Allen, Stuart Lee, Angela Barnes, other Zoe Lyons, other comedians. Is there anything we can do to help? And it was, I don't want to get too like emotional about it, but
Oh, do, Geoff.
you want me to cry? I might cry, but it was amazing for some of those people, literally, not because I'd approached them, but to contact me and say, this thing that's happened, Leicester Comedy Festival, is really important and we want to help if we can. And that gave me an enormous boost, because at times you're just thinking, this is never going to work. I mean, let's just give up. We've had a great run. Why are we carrying on? And the more people... So I ended up doing some online Q&As like this with comedians, and we charge people money to watch them online and all of that. And it was a real boost, I think, to me and the other people working on the festival, that people seem to give a shit about this thing. And that was a massively needed boost, because I think for lots of people who work in this world, it kind of was. I mean, you must have had it. It sort of fell apart, really.
Yeah,
and
you had no work, and
yeah, and it was really difficult. But the trustees stayed with us, and the staff team stayed with us, and halfway through the pandemic, some idiot thought it would be a really good idea to take over a venue in Leicester City Centre and rename it from the Cookie to the Big Difference, and we would open a venue during a pandemic. That was one of my best moves, I think, over 30 years. But now I did some work on Thursday, Friday, I can't remember when, but we've beaten last year's sales for this year's festival, and we're pretty close to where we were, however long ago, pre-pandemic.
When did you decide to move on and leave it to the next
generation?
Yeah. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello, Charlotte. So I've been saying to my partner and my friends for years that I wouldn't do it forever, and I have thought many times. When we were 21, it sounds a bit daft now, but I thought to myself, 21 years, Geoff, well done, time to go. But it didn't really feel like the right sort of time, and if you say you're not going to do something forever and you've done it for 30 years, it kind of starts to feel like you've done it forever. So I decided where are we now, 23, so it was the autumn of 21, I started to think, when we're 30, that'll be a good time to stop. And so it was announced, and I decided, and it was announced last March. So I've had the longest leaving do in the history of anyone. And despite what some people today have said to me, you're not really going, are you? I am really going.
You'll be around there. You're not moving out of Leicester, are you?
We're not moving from Leicester, and so I will wait and see what happens. But it feels, up until very recently, it felt quite. I don't know whether this is actually the right time to go. Is it in safe hands? Is it going to outlive me? Is it going to carry on for another 30 years? All that kind of stuff.
I think it's going to, don't you?
And I think it will. And very recently, like in the last few weeks before the festival, I kind of thought, actually, do you know what? Charlotte is amazing. Michael, who's going to be the new chief executive, is wonderful. I trust the rest of the team, lots of whom are here today, but they're wonderful people. And that ethos that I talked about before about community and celebration of British comedy and the fact that it's a charity, the trustees get it, the team get it. It feels like it's now time for me to leave it to them and go.
It's kind of made Leicester a greater place as well, what you've done, do you think?
Well, people say it has. I mean, I suppose so, Arthur. I mean, I'm not...
It has, Geoff. Take it from me.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I'm sure it has. And it is, it is very odd when people say King Richard, the football team, Curve, De Montfort Hall, And this little student project that we set up 30 years ago are all, I mean, I'm sure there's other things, a part of the DNA of Leicester. And it's, I know people like it, and I know people look forward to it, and people, a lot of you today have come from a long way away to be here. It's really nice. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a trivial way at all. It's just nice.
It's got a kind of warmth about it, a festival, that, and it's got bigger and bigger, hasn't it? I mean, how do you think of it going forward?
Well, I hope it's going to be shit in the future, so I can turn around and say, "Told you so." People. I mean, the whole thing about Edinburgh Fringe at the moment, which some people might know about, but people are, you know, is it too big? Is it going to get smaller? All of that. For a long time, people said to me, when are you going to be as big as Edinburgh? And it's like, well, that's an arts festival. It's different. It's in Edinburgh. That's not the competition for me.
It's a different thing.
It's a different thing. So I don't know how bigger it will get. There's never been, as I've sort of suggested today, there's never been a plan to make it as big as it is now. It's just kind of morphed and evolved over time and naturally become bigger, I think. So I think the honest answer is I just hope it continues. That's what I'd like.
I think it's going to, Geoff, and I think you'll always be a part of it. Let's conclude this interview. I'd like to invite everyone to give a huge round of applause to the man who started this all, and you've all been part of it. Ladies, gentlemen, whoever you are, Geoff Rowe. Stand up.
Oops. Careful.
And I'd like to invite you to put this on, Geoff.
It's not big enough.
Geoff Rowe.
Thank you.
What a lovely guy. Well done, Geoff.